trigger warning for our listeners. This story contains content about suicide.
All right, quiet on the set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Steve, a couple of weeks ago I was back in the Twin Cities visiting my mom, who is a true crime nut.
A woman after my own heart.
Yes, I think I've talked about, we saw Silence of the Lambs when it first came out, and she just loves to be scared. But she loves these true crime stories, so we decided to watch 2020, and the story of Sherry Papini was on that night. Do you know this story?
Oh, I've just been reading about her.
Oh my goodness. So in 2016, she went missing on a jog. 22 days later, she was found on a highway about 146 miles from where she lived. She claimed she had been kidnapped, but in fact, she masterminded her own disappearance. She inflicted a whole bunch of injuries on herself.
Didn't she hit herself in the face with a hockey stick?
Yes, as well as had an ex-boyfriend or current boyfriend, I'm not sure which, throw some things at her, so she had bruises all over. She was married and had 2 children at the time. She claimed she was kidnapped by 2 Hispanic women. It never happened.
Wow.
I know. Now, why am I bringing this up?
Does this sound familiar?
Yes, because today we're going to be talking about an actress from the golden age that did something very similar.
Yes, and it's a fascinating story. We're talking about MARIE McDONALD. A little background on Marie before we get to the good juicy part. She was born Cora Marie Fry in Bergen, Kentucky. She was the only child of an ex-Ziegfeld girl and a prison warden.
Well, there you go.
How about that? Her parents divorced when she was young. Her mom took her to Yonkers, New York. Her father went on to Leavenworth, Kansas, where he was a prison guard there, the famous notorious prison. Her mother eventually remarried a nightclub owner and really encouraged her daughter, who had grown into this lovely young woman, to enter beauty pageants and try to go for a showbiz career. She actually showed a little interest in journalism at first, Marie, but her mother was having none of it. I think she wanted to live vicariously through her pretty daughter's life, so she pushed her into showbiz.
Right, but Marie actually turned down a scholarship to Columbia for journalism.
She did. I think at her mother's beckoning.
At the insistence of her mother, she enters a number of beauty pageants, and she actually wins quite a few of them, including the Queen of Coney Island.
And who would not want to be the Queen of Coney Island?
No, right? So the attention that she gets from these beauty pageants actually leads her to Broadway.
Yeah, she gets a part in the chorus of the George White Scandals, which was a Broadway musical revue in 1939. And after that, she moved over to the Earl Carroll Vanities, which was another musical revue, but her time there didn't last long because she and another young chorus girl named Yvonne DiCarlo actually got fired on the same day for, and get this, they got fired for overmaking their faces.
No way.
You can get fired for that?
I had no idea. Lots of people would be fired around this town, right?
Oh my God. I'd like to be the overmaking police.
Oh my gosh. Now, isn't it during this time, though, that she actually gets married?
Yeah, she married super young.
And her first marriage lasts only 3 weeks.
Yeah, it was to a sports writer named Richard Allord. I think that I'm saying that correctly. It literally was annulled after 3 weeks and it was rumored that they split up because Marie discovered that the diamond ring he had given her was a fake.
Oh, dear.
Don't give Mama a fake diamond.
No. Well, I guess that pissed her off enough to move to Hollywood in 1940, right? And she gets work as a dancer at the Florentine Gardens nightclub. Now, she clearly has talent as a singer because she goes on to other nightclubs and other big bands that she's singing for.
Yeah, she meets the great band leader Tommy Dorsey, and he hires her for his radio program, and he also becomes becomes somewhat of a mentor to her. You know, she sang with Charlie Barnett. I mean, she really had a nice singing career with these big bands. Well, of course, while she was singing with these big bands, guess what happened?
She gets spotted by a talent agent. Gee,
She gets
never heard that
spotted
story.
by a talent scout, which seems to be the case everywhere.
And that's at Universal Studios,
yeah,
right?
and she gets a contract there. At Universal, they start her on the starlet treatment. They change her natural brown hair to blonde. They give her a stage name of MARIE McDONALD, which her mentor Tommy Dorsey helped select that name for her. And then she ends up getting a couple of bit parts in a few movies. Most notably was the Abbott and Costello comedy Pardon My Sarong in 1942. And it was around this time that Marie started dating the actor Bruce Cabot. She ended up, because of her dating him, she ended up getting her name in the papers, which she liked. She liked it a lot. And she realized right then that she may not be able to get movie critics to notice her performances, but she could certainly get the gossip columnists to write about her.
Right.
And this knowledge, I think, really shaped her career and a lot of decisions she made down the line.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, and another thing that would have helped her career is the next person she ends up marrying, who is talent agent and producer Vic Orsatti. He represented some of the biggest stars of the 20s and 30s, including Judy Garland, Betty Grable, and Edward G. Robinson. So he's not only her husband, but he also helps secure a contract for her at Paramount.
Yeah, I mean, what a wedding present. Here's a contract at Paramount. I love it.
Come on, Lindsay, help me out here.
And you know, over at Paramount, she got a really important role pretty much right off the bat, where she played Alan Ladd's sassy, sexy secretary in Lucky Jordan in 1942.
Yeah.
And she was also a standout in I Love a Soldier, 1944, where she played Paulette Goddard's welder friend. I love that she's a welder.
I know. I love that too.
Kind of like Rosie, you know.
Rosie the Riveter.
The Riveter.
So she goes on to that same year, gets great reviews in a drama, Guest in the House, 1944. It's a small part, but it's with Ann Baxter.
Yeah. And you know, the Hollywood Reporter wrote about this performance.
Yeah.
And I love this review. It said, "It is Marie McDonald who comes close to walking away with the picture. Her zestful and keenly understanding portrayal of the artist model is a brilliant and almost flawless performance, which coupled with her loveliness makes her the standout of the picture."
Wow.
What a great review to get early on in your career.
And wouldn't you think that that would just take you right to the heights?
Yeah, and you know, for a minute it did, because right after that, she got the title role in, you know, it was a fun, fluffy comedy called Getting Gertie's Garter. we love alliteration around here.
Right.
That was 1945, and it starred Dennis O'Keefe, who we talked about last week. Her star was on the rise, and around then, the war's going on, and like most good Americans, McDonald did her part. She wanted to keep the morale up of the troops, so she spent hours posing for cheesecake photos and appearing on magazines like Yank. You know, it made her one of the most popular pinups of the war.
So her husband, Vic Orsatti, gets her seen by Louis B. Mayer. He ends up signing her to a contract at MGM. So she's now been at 3 different studios. She's been at Universal, Paramount, now MGM. And boy, does she get a role. She's playing the leading role opposite Gene Kelly in the musical Living in a Big Way in 1946. However, it is a huge financial and artistic failure.
Huge.
It flops.
MGM basically made her the scapegoat for why it failed, because they weren't going to touch their boy Gene Kelly.
Right, exactly.
And she kind of saw the writing on the wall that she didn't have much future at MGM, but yet she's stuck in this long-term contract.
Right.
So she bought herself out.
So she bought
That was my understanding.
She bought herself out, and she really doesn't have very many parts after this.
No, she really, really doesn't. I mean, you look at her filmography, it's not that long.
It's not that long.
Yeah.
And right after this, and maybe because of this, she and Orsatti divorce in 47, the year after this film has come out. And she's quoted at the time as saying, "Husbands are much easier to find than good agents."
Well, that's funny. You're giving up both.
Yeah.
Well, Missy didn't waste much time.
No, she didn't.
After her divorce, engages in these high-profile romances with this Cuban millionaire and also mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel.
All right.
This was all great fodder for the gossip columns, which she loved.
So this next part of her life could be a movie in and of itself. She soon begins seriously dating shoe tycoon Harry Carole. He ends up becoming husband number 3 and husband number 4, right? So they get married, they get divorced, they remarry, and they get divorced again. Initially, they were married in September of 47. Unfortunately, during that time period, McDonald suffered several miscarriages. The couple ends up adopting 2 children, Denise and Harrison, but they end up getting separated in August of 54 and divorced that November.
Yes. While they were separated in June of 1954, McDonald was arrested for driving under the influence of narcotics and hit and run after hitting 3 parked cars in Beverly Hills. She got off with a fine and probation, but this would be just the beginning of her problems with booze and narcotics.
Right. So shortly, I think after that, Steve, if I'm not mistaken, she announces with Harry Carole that they're going to get married again.
Yes.
But in January of 55, she claims that they're not going to get married. It's all off because she's allergic to Carole. In fact, she is quoted, at least by the New York Times, as saying, the trouble with Harry is that I'm allergic to him. He makes me break out in a rash. Okay, well, I guess she found some medication for the rash because they do end up getting married in June of 55. In Arizona. They separate again in 1956, and in May, Carole files for divorce, claiming that McDonald had beat him, causing him grievous mental suffering. One more little thing about this. At the time of their separation, McDonald was pregnant with their first biological child.
Yes.
So Carole finds this out, drops the divorce suit in June, but in July, McDonald files for divorce from Carole and was granted a decree later that month, but the divorce was never finalized. So their daughter, Tina Marie, is born to them both in September 1956. They separate, and what does Marie do? She starts dating somebody else.
Oh, Marie.
Michael Wilding, who we know from Elizabeth Taylor.
Right. He had just gotten divorced from Elizabeth Taylor when he took up with Marie McDonald.
Right.
It was around this time that she separated from Carole. She's dating Michael Wilding. And then the most bizarre episode of her life occurred.
Right.
And this is going to tie into your introduction.
Well, if you've all got your flow charts out, look at those while we cut to break. But before we do that, let's give this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Yes, and the pop quiz is, of course, Hollywood loved to give cute little monikers to their starlets. Usually they were degrading and misogynistic, like the Ping Girl with Carole Landis or the Oomph Girl with Ann Sheridan. Mm-hmm. Marie McDonald had a name. What was it?
All right. We will be back with the answer and more about Marie McDonald after this.
All right, Steve and Ann will be right back, but first, another stop on the Hollywood tour. You know, the Hollywood Walk of Fame is divided into 6 different categories, right? Motion pictures, broadcast television, audio recording or music, broadcast radio, theater, live performance, that was added in 1984, and sports entertainment, added just last year. Now, all of those are set against a star-shaped background, thus the expression, that person got a star on the Walk of Fame. Well, here's something cool. In 1969, the crew of Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon. And to commemorate this occasion, Hollywood decided to give those 3 astronauts their own stars on the Walk of Fame. But their stars are unique. Their names got written on a symbol of the moon. So it's perfectly round, not star-shaped. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins have moons on the Hollywood Walk of Fame instead of stars. The eagle has landed. And now back to our stars of this podcast, Steve and Nan from Beneath the Hollywood Side.
Welcome back, everybody. Got a great episode going about Marie McDonald. But before we get back into it, I just wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week. And it's a great old friend of mine from college who's been so supportive, so wonderful. He lets me know what he thinks of the episodes. He shares it with everybody. He likes it. He just does everything right. So that person is Van O'Neill. So thank you, Van.
Thank you, Van.
Thanks, Van.
Right. So, when we last spoke...
Oh, it's getting good now.
Marie McDonald career is kind of, waning a bit. And personally, she is struggling with a serious addiction to prescription pills and alcohol. As you mentioned, she was arrested, right, for drunk driving, hit and run. If you're catching up with the number of marriages, she's just divorced Carole for the second time, so that was husband number 4.
Right. Well, she's actually separated from him during this period.
Okay.
She's not quite divorced from him the second time yet.
But this is when the most bizarre thing
Yes.
happens.
Yeah.
On January 4th, 1957, her mother reports to the police that McDonald has been kidnapped. Her abductors left a ransom note. They also called her soon-to-be ex-husband, Harry Carole. During this kidnapping, McDonald was supposedly held somewhere in a home where she had access to a telephone.
And wouldn't you think if you've been kidnapped, you've got access to the phone, you're going to call the police, right?
Well, of course, Steve. Well, that's what I would do.
Wrong.
Okay.
Not Marie McDonald.
Who did she call?
She makes 3 calls. She calls gossip columnist Harrison Carroll.
Okay.
She then calls her agent.
Okay.
And she then calls her boyfriend, Michael Wilding. So when questioned about it later, she said, well, they were the only numbers I could come up with. Girl, you can't hit 0 on that phone.
I think, well, it would have been dial, right?
Yeah, that's right. Would have been the dial's phone.
So the next day, a truck driver finds McDonald on the highway, and I'm telling you, it's Sherry Papini. I wonder if she knew about Marie McDonald.
I wonder if she studied this case.
Oh, my goodness. She has on silk pajamas and a robe, and she's wandering along the Mojave Desert Highway. She has a black eye, and 2 caps on her teeth were missing.
Yeah. In fact, she even showed the truck driver a couple of pieces of her teeth that had been broken in this whatever happened.
So the police, obviously, the truck driver gets her to the police start investigating, and this is when her story just changes.
And what was really interesting was that, the police asked McDonald to take a lie detector test.
Okay.
And she refused.
Oh.
But she did suggest, in order to help them with the case, that they do a live reenactment of the kidnapping at her house.
Okay, with reporters there?
Well, on January the 9th, 5 days after she was rescued, LAPD, they staged this elaborate reenactment of Marie's kidnapping, where, of course, she is the star, in full costume, I might add.
Yes.
Dozens of reporters are on hand to witness the spectacle, and she was loving every minute of it. One of the reporters who was there, a guy named James Bacon, he later wrote an article in which he said that the exploits had everything any Cecil B. DeMille epic ever had, except camels. So apparently she just put on a big old showy reenactment, for the police. And they investigated her story. Harry Carole had received a phone call from the supposed kidnappers asking for $30,000.
Okay.
The police had just a lot of questions. One was, why was the ransom note in her mailbox in her house in Encino? Well, who would have ever looked for it there?
Yes, yes.
That struck them as odd. And also it struck them odd that when they got there, that her security gate was locked. So how did somebody get in or out? They just had a lot of questions, and her story just wasn't quite adding up.
And didn't they also find the same newspaper in her fireplace that was used?
Because they ended up, the kidnappers supposedly created this ransom note where they literally did the cliched thing of cutting out letters from the newspaper and making a ransom note, which they put in her own mailbox. Yeah. They found the newspapers in her fireplace. They also found a copy of the book, The Fuzzy Pink Nightgown, which was a novel that was about a movie star who was kidnapped, and the plot of the book was surprisingly similar to Marie McDonald's story.
Maybe those people that abducted her brought the book with, and they wanted a craft project, and they put together the note. No.
If I'm going to kidnap a movie star and I'm in her house, am I really going to take the time to get scissors and newspapers and cut out, a ransom note and put it in her own mailbox?
Exactly. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Yeah. Well, all this time she is denying, of course, that this was a hoax. In fact, the New York Times quotes her as saying that she pointed to her black eye and told the reporters who were crowded around her, no woman would allow herself to be photographed with this shiner if it weren't for real.
And Marie, she went on to say that she believed that her estranged husband, Harry Carole, had been behind the kidnapping.
Oh, my gosh.
He countered and said that she was not a well woman and she'd probably staged it herself. Well, McDonald later admitted that Carole Carl had nothing to do with the kidnapping, that she only said that in a fit of anger because he was asking for a divorce.
Okay. Well, this is sort of leading to a pattern. I mean, there's a lot of untruths that are happening.
Yeah, I think there was a little pathological disorder, I think, to Marie McDonald. So ultimately, when McDonald's kidnapping case came before a grand jury, and it went to a grand jury, the court dismissed the case. There wasn't enough evidence to really prosecute anyone.
Right. And she was not arrested for anything either. So it was kind of, very different than today's time. If you've lied to the police like that, a lot of times you would get arrested yourself.
Oh, yeah, Sherry Papini's going away.
Yeah,
I think.
Point.
Well, one of my favorite parts about this whole thing, even after Marie and Harry Carl, all of those nasty, bitter accusations about you did it, you think they hate each other. Well, according to Luella Parsons' column in June 7th, 1957, after all of that, they get back together romantically.
Oh my gosh! But they don't get married a third time.
Well, they're still married. They're not officially divorced yet. They were just separated when the kidnapping happened. So they end up coming back together as a couple after all of this. Go figure. And they remain romantically involved until finally divorcing for good in 1958.
Well, and then Marie McDonald's life goes into husband number 5.
Yeah, her life really takes a spin out of control here.
Yeah, she marries a gentleman by the name of Lou Bass. We think he was a theatrical agent or a TV executive, one or the other. I've seen both things attributed to him.
And I think he was at William Morris.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
That marriage is followed by husband number 6, Edward P. Callahan.
Yeah, which is probably the shortest marriage, known to mankind, because after 48 hours, it was annulled because Ed Callahan said that he basically claimed fraud.
Okay.
He said that Marie did not want to live with him. She did not want to have more children. She did not want to do the things that he expected of a wife.
Right. And he was an attorney, so he'd be able to get that annulled pretty quickly. Now, shortly thereafter, she attempts suicide.
She does, in Las Vegas.
Yeah, and the drugs and alcohol are really starting to affect her life in a very serious way.
Around this time, she attempted a career comeback, but it fizzled after this big publicity buildup in the Jerry Lewis vehicle, The Geisha Boy, from 1958. The movie was terrible. It did nothing for her. The only noteworthy thing about this film is it was the film debut of actress Suzanne Pleshette.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
but,
interesting.
did not help her at all. And she only made one more film after that.
Okay. Well, in 1963, she is in Australia and ends up suffering a nervous breakdown where she's committed to a psychiatric ward, but apparently ran away a few days later.
Yeah, from what I've read, she crawled out of a small window in her room, only wearing like a hospital gown and a robe, which seems to be her MO.
And got on a plane?
And I don't know what happened from that point, but she ended up showing up a couple of days later back in Los Angeles.
Okay.
My favorite part of that whole story was that when she was interviewed in Los Angeles after the incident with the psych ward, she said that she had been admitted there for ulcers. Okay, how many psych hospitals do you know treat ulcers?
Yes, I saw that actually in her obituary in the New York Times. So she's back in the States, and she runs into a few different problems. Number one, she's arrested for forging a prescription, which is kind of a big deal. She's fined $250. There are also reports that a creditor sued her for payment of a chinchilla coat. She's put on 3 years probation for the writing of the prescription. So in 1963, McDonald marries her 7th husband, producer Donald F. Taylor.
Also in 1963, she appears in her final film.
Okay.
And it's this notoriously awful sex comedy called Promises, Promises that starred Jane Mansfield. A very inauspicious ending to a career. About two couples who basically have a drunken weekend and partner swap, and the women get pregnant and they're not really sure who the father is.
Oh my word. That's shocking in 2024.
Very shocking for 1963.
Yeah. Well, on October 21st, 1965, McDonald's 7th husband, Donald, finds her slumped over her dressing table, and she apparently had died from an overdose of pills. The coroner ultimately ruled her death accidental, but many of her friends think that it was suicide and that she just had had enough.
I know, and she was only 42, so young. And what's really creepy about this is 3 months later, Donald Taylor, he goes into the same bedroom where Marie McDonald died. He writes a suicide note, and he takes a fatal dose of Seconal from the same bottle that killed McDonald. So sad.
Which is so sad. And that was on January 3rd, 1966. He is found on the floor in his bedroom by his stepdaughter, Denise Carroll, who was 16 at the time. And she was with her boyfriend. She calls Debbie Reynolds her mother.
Because Harry Carroll had since remarried to Debbie Reynolds.
Right, exactly. That's an important point.
Yeah.
And Debbie Reynolds rushes to the Taylor home after learning of the death. Donald Taylor had left 2 notes. One was to his lawyer, and the other was to a business partner of Marie McDonald's who was trying to get a cosmetic line off the ground. It's such a sad end.
Yeah, and the 3 McDonald children, they ended up being raised by Harry Carroll and Debbie Reynolds. And from what I've read, Debbie Reynolds was a wonderful stepmother to these kids. And anybody who knows the Debbie Reynolds story knows that eventually she had to file bankruptcy because Harry Carroll basically gambled away all their money.
All their money.
And she spent the rest of her life trying to get back to where she was.
That poor woman worked her
I know.
tush off. I mean, she was working up until the day she died, practically.
I know.
Yeah. Well, it's a really sad ending and a testament to how important mental health is.
Especially in such a volatile business.
Yeah, in such a volatile business. But I think even to this day, Steve, I think mental health, at least in the United States, is not treated in the way that it should be, you know?
Yeah, and back then, I mean, it was such a negative thing to have to admit that you needed help with your emotional state.
Right.
So nobody would ever speak up.
Right. But hopefully nowadays we know that speaking up is important and finding help is important.
Absolutely.
Well, let's jump into the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
And the question was, of all the monikers given to young actresses in Hollywood, what was Marie McDonald's moniker?
It's a pretty awful one.
And it's awful. It's maybe next to the Oomph girl, maybe the worst one.
Yes.
It's the body.
Oh.
Marie the Body McDonald, they called her.
Well.
And in fact, when you look back at some of these newspaper articles about her case, they even use that moniker, the body, in newspaper headlines, like the body found on freeway in
it's
Indio.
horrible.
It's just so bad, such bad taste.
Really a tragic loss, and who knows what Marie McDonald might have been capable of had she lived a long life.
Yes.
We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review and if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywood and we are on Facebook, Instagram, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And we'd love to hear from you, so please email us anytime at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor, Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.